Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever and whenever you're joining us from. We hope that you're well. My name is Johanna Ransmeier, and I would like to welcome you to the third in a series of 4 public panels on human rights in China. This series is sponsored by the Pozen Center, the History Department, and the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Chicago. We are honored to be joined today by 4 distinguished guests to discuss 1989, Tiananmen, the Chinese democracy movement, the massacre, and its impact. Each of our speakers brings a different perspective on 1989, how those events are remembered, and their relevance today. As our speakers are speaking, please feel free to make comments and interventions in the Q&A. And if you want to identify yourself, please do. But if you want to remain anonymous, that's just fine as well. Our speakers and moderators will be able to see your questions as they come in, and we will direct them to the panelists after they speak. Let me first introduce my co-moderator, who will then take the floor to say a few words and introduce our first panelist. Teng Biao will be familiar already to many of you. Some of you are actually enrolled in the class that he and I are teaching together. He is an academic lawyer and human rights activist. He was formerly a lecturer at the China University of Political Science and Law and has been a visiting fellow at Harvard Law School, Yale Law School, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, NYU, Hunter College, and Harvard's Carr Center for Human Rights. Teng has defended cases involving freedom of expression, religious freedom, the death penalty, Tibetans and Uyghurs. He has been an outspoken and tireless advocate. And it has been a great honor for us at the University of Chicago to have him currently visiting us as the Pozen professor at the Pozen Family Center for Human Rights. So without further ado, here's Teng Biao.
Thank you very much, Johanna. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this event. And let me first introduce our first speaker. We have the privilege to have Professor Perry Link today. Perry Link has degrees in Western philosophy and Chinese history from Harvard University, and for most of his career, taught modern Chinese language and literature at Princeton University. He's now Chancellorial Chair for teaching across disciplines at the University of California, Riverside. His recent books include Anatomy of Chinese Rhythm, Metaphor, and Politics, and another book on Liu Xiaobo. So Perry is very supportive of Chinese human rights defenders and the dissidents. He's called like 中国人民的老朋友, an old friend of Chinese people, not Chinese government. Perry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Teng Biao. It's an honor to be with you and with Kaixi and with everyone else today. I am going to talk about the impact of Liu Si and invent a term for everybody that I want to call the public covenant that I think the massacre has destroyed. To generalize very broadly, we all know that in Confucian society, people learn to and identify with being a good person, 做人, and then 做 various roles, the father, the wife, the son, all of these roles. And that, in a sense, asks one to use one's private morality to do the right thing and be a good person in the correct way. But what I mean by a public covenant is that it was also part of Confucian society, broadly speaking, that the person was confident that others also would have the same kind of values, so that it wasn't just a matter of exercising one's own conscience. I want to illustrate this with a generalization about Chinese fiction in the late Ming stories that we call San Yan Er Pai in the late 17th century. There are a lot of stories where people commit suicide because they're driven to that by someone who's oppressing them. And as a last gesture in this world, they kill themselves. But the point I want to make is that they choose the doorstep of the wrongdoer as the site to commit the suicide. Why do they do that? They're leaving this world, they're gone, but they have the confidence that by committing suicide there, they're making a statement that others in the society will notice and will agree with. They're saying, in effect, all right, you win, but the public will see that you have done wrong. Now, since the massacre in Beijing, there's been a revival of private moralities of various kinds, and we have some good books on the revival of religion, the need to anchor oneself. But I want to focus on this public covenant, as I want to call it, which is not there anymore. And a very much used to be there. Now, I don't want to be claiming that in traditional China, everyone behaved wonderfully. No, I'm not Leibniz or Voltaire, who saw that the society was ruled by scholars who wrote poetry and hung calligraphy and that everyone was perfect. No, of course, daily life in any society falls short of public norms. That's the human condition. But what I mean is that a person knows what ought to be in this public covenant and can be confident that others share those values. Now, I want to give a couple of examples quickly because we have only 10 minutes each. One is, let's take the problem of cheating in schools. It happens in China. It happens even in places like Chicago and California. Chinese students at my campus are really, really good at cheating. They can get the right answers to a quiz within 5 minutes and all write them down. And only the Chinese students get those right answers. So something is really magical about how well they do it. Now, we might ask, why? Is it because they don't know that it's wrong? Sometimes good-hearted administrators in the US view it that way. They're from a different culture and they may not get it. But no, they do know that it's wrong. And you know that they know it because they try to hide it. So let's ask again the question, why do they do it? They're not bad people, but why do they do it? It's because everyone else is doing it. And if you don't, then it puts you at an unfair disadvantage. In essence, it's just plain stupid. So to reduce it to a syllogism, if I cheat, I am wrong. If I don't cheat, I am stupid. And in this world that we have, being stupid is worse than being wrong. So I'll choose to be wrong. I'll give another quick example. When a new partner joins a company in China, it's common that we want this person to be corrupt. What? You say corrupt? No, you want your new partner to be clean. No, it's quite common that we want the new partner to be corrupt just so that he can't be clean and in that status squeal on us. If he's corrupt too, then we have the leverage that can protect our own corruption because he's in it too. Another example, if you will, of it's better to be wrong than to be stupid. This has led, I would argue, in recent decades in China to a split consciousness. And I'm not the only one who talks about this. A lot of people do. People play different roles in different contexts, wearing different masks in different situations. And life can even become a sort of multifaceted game of pretenses. I show this there and show that there, all very smartly, not stupid. But that leaves it impossible for one to be authentic. And it might even be stupid to try. I think of Ai Weiwei and his naming of his company, Fake Design, made for a world where everything is fake. So I'm going to fit into that. Now, I want to ask quickly, was it always this way in communist China? No, it wasn't. I was talking about this problem a few days ago with Li Shuxian, the widow of Fang Lizhi, and she was emotional about the point. She said, we weren't that way in the early 50s. We wanted socialism to work. We wanted to be good people. We were extremely frank and authentic about our hopes. We slept on the floor of the gymnasium because the dorms at Beidao weren't yet ready, and we were happy to do so because this was so much what we wanted. Now, what does this have to do with June 4th? I won't argue for you that June 4th was the turning point all by itself. I think Mao and the Cultural Revolution had a lot to do with it. In fact, I think we could see June 4th as a consequence of Mao and the Cultural Revolution. But I do think that June 4th was a significant turning point. In fact, maybe the main one. For one, it killed once and for all even the hint of idealism in the socialist language. It stopped once and for all the talk of looking at people in the leadership who were reformists and whom we might cooperate with. All through the 80s, there was watching of people like Hu Tao Bang and Tian Yun and Hu Qili and these reformists. That didn't happen. Right after June 4th on, the leadership became a black box that seemed only motivated by its own interests. And we had the parceling out of the economy, the electric system to Li Peng and his family, so that his daughter, Li Xiaolin, was called the Queen of Electricity. And the whole electric system was Li Jia Dian, of course, punning on the word Dian there. And Jiang Minhong, the son of Jiang Zemin, becomes Mr. IT, to whom one has to go. I mean, there have been analyses. Minty had a lot of setting up of this access to chunks of the Chinese economy for the families of the super elite. There have been exposés in the Western press of the family of Wen Jiabao and Xi Jinping and others. And this corruption as a model at the top just is imitated and percolates all the way down, so that the local mafiosa at the bottom are in a tacit relationship with the rulers at the top in, we're corrupt for you, we're going to keep the lid on things for you if you let us do what we're going to do. And it turns out that in the public, money making and an adolescent kind of nationalism, a narrow nationalism, become the only state-approved public values. Now, again, I'm not going to argue that all of this came from June 4th, but I do see June 4th as a very significant turning point in this direction. And if you view it that way, the loss that we see is much, much bigger than the hundreds or thousands or whatever it was of people who were killed, terrible as that was. This affects the whole country. China has become, ethically speaking, a sort of basket case, a lantanzi, and now it's spreading to the rest of the world. And that problem is much, much bigger than just the ones who were killed on June 4th. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Perry, for that reflection on the state that we're left in China today and the idea of the public covenant. I think that's a very useful concept to be thinking with. And you were, of course, on the ground in '89. I'm going to turn the floor over next to another figure who was a very familiar face to anyone who was watching events in '89, and that is Wu Kaishi, one of the most recognizable faces from the 1989 student leadership. Wu Kaishi was famous for his participation in the dramatic hunger strike. He's in exile now, based in Taiwan. He's still considered one of the quote unquote most wanted by the Beijing government, though also ironically has been unable to, about a decade ago, to try to turn himself in to go home to try to see his parents. He's joining us, as I said, from Taiwan, where he's frequently consulted as an opinion leader here, as a columnist, a political commentator. He's a documentary maker. He currently serves as the Executive Deputy General Secretary of the Taiwan Parliamentary Human Rights Commission. So he's an important figure on the landscape, not just with regard to the PRC, but also with regard to Taiwan. He's an emeritus board member of Reporters Without Borders. As an Uyghur, he's committed to international campaigns opposing the Uyghur genocide and is honorary chairman of the DC-based organization Campaign for Uyghurs and honorary president of the Ilim Tohti Institute, which is a Munich-based NGO. So we're very happy to have Kaishi with us to reflect on events in '89 from the perspective of the student leadership. Thanks. Oh, you have to unmute yourself and start over. Oh.
Oh, no sound.
Or Casey, we still don't have your sound. Hang on a sec.
Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me now?
Yes, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. All right. Sorry about that. Yeah. Good morning from Taipei. Thank you, Johanna, Teng Biao, for organizing this. Good to be with all of you, Perry, Andy, and Louisa. Nice to see you all. I think, yes, 1989, June 4th, to me, being a part of the student movement, is a natural development of what happened before it. I would say before 1989, China, the decade of 80s was fascinating. Well, I was a teen at that time, but I still remember vividly how the society turned from Cultural Revolution time into, a military coup d'etat to arrested the widow of Mao Zedong, and then the whole Beijing. I was living in Beijing at that time. The people in Beijing, it seems, to become alcoholic over in one night, and then consumed most of the alcohols that's available in the nearby stores. And although at that time I was only, a little boy, but still I remember the joy of people as if they have seen a long shaded hope during the Cultural Revolution time. And that's the word that I would like to use to describe the decade of 80s. Hope. From the very beginning, although you don't really, if you look back today, you don't really see much of a difference in the Hua Guofeng era. But didn't last too, but Hua Guofeng was the one who ended a Cultural Revolution. That gives you hope. And then it didn't last long when Deng Xiaoping came along to the power, introduced the idea of open and reform, very fascinating two words. Open, well, that basically acknowledged for a long time we were in a lockdown, in a closed down society. And then not only with the two slogans, Deng Xiaoping also started in that era to start to acknowledge mistakes of the Chinese Communist Party have made in the 30 years of its ruling. That also gives people hope, of course. And then for whatever reason, whatever the necessity the communists deemed that it is, it allowed reflection on Cultural Revolution. Tons of literature emerged into the society in the 80s, in the middle of 80s. We call it 伤痕文学, wound literatures. And then actually, it's not, the literature wouldn't wound you, it just review the wound that you have been concealed, which is also a good action to heal the wound, to give you a little bit of more hope. Political reform was discussed. Although you don't really see the open election coming in the near future, but you see things are different. For instance, the People's Congress, a standing committee, is having a vivid debate, and then even sometimes overthrow some of the bills that was introduced by the Communist Party. And then that's live covered on CCTV. All these are little hopes, little signs that gives you hopes. Even like in the People's Congress, they usually playing a marching band's music, and then while the every delegate stand up and applause to welcome the leaders of the country and the parties were marching, also applauding themselves into the grand hall of the people. That scene was changed in the later 80s by Deng Xiaoping and Hu Tao Bang says that's just ridiculous. We're going to have to change that. We're going to remove most of the Mao's portrait. We're going to sit down in the grand hall of people together with the delegates. And then when the time comes, it rings and we start our session. These are small little things that gives people hope. And then that also inspired a lot of intelligentsia, a lot of people among intelligentsias to push for that very word, democracy. And then, of course, we know the influence of Fang Lijie and Liu Xiaobo alike. And then the direct result of their lecturing about democracy was part of the grand wave, grand trend that the country is moving toward the direction better tomorrow than yesterday. So that kind of sensation lead to the the obvious rising of the 1989 student movement, when sometimes Communist Party, and from what we see is a conservative sect, suppresses those voices of hope. Like in 1986, late 86, 87 student movement. After that, the anti-spiritual pollution campaign, anti-bourgeois liberalism campaign, a removal of Fang Lijie from his position, and then of course, Zhenya suppressing the students who participated in 1989. And then suppressing the student leaders who took the leading role in the student movement of late 1986, early 1987. And then, of course, in the year 1989, we realized the word suppression to use to describe what they did in the 86, 87 was an understatement in comparison to what they did in 1989. So I often discuss the student movement of 1989 as a child given birth by Deng Xiaoping himself to end the Deng Xiaoping era, to overthrow the Deng Xiaoping dynasty. And we tried, and we didn't succeed. What's the impact of 1989? Afterward, I would totally agree with our panelist, Professor Link, he just described. After 1989, the China become a very different China. Well, what happened? Well, after you invade your own capital, I really love this term. Thank you, Perry. So you don't see the necessity or reason behind continuous lying anymore. Communist Party committed really, really hard effort before 1989 to lie to its lie to its subjects, to lie to China, but while lying to while using their propaganda machine to lying to Chinese people about Communist Party being the legitimate and advanced force to rule the society. At that time, with that kind of lying, they keep themselves. With that kind of lying, they keep themselves in a position. But also, that kind of lying prevent them from openly loot the country. But after a massacre, they find there is no longer a way to continue that lie. So they changed the method from propaganda lying into iron fist police state method. And with that kind of method, you just scare enough people with the massacre you have conducted, and then deploy enough police on the street to scare the next possible uprising. And then realize they no longer need to lie. They no longer well, they no longer could lie and they couldn't carry out their lies, but then also they no longer need to lie. So they can now loot the country publicly. And then in 1992, after the famous tour of to the south by Deng Xiaoping, he struck a deal with Chinese people. A deal is that, well, okay, we're going to give in to some of the conditions, some of the demand the 1989 students and the people have been putting forward, which is market economy, personal property rights, all these things, or say freedom and the economic front. In exchange, you're going to give us your submission politically. You are no longer going to challenge us politically. That deal was struck by Communist Party in 1992 after 3 years of economic recessions. Yes, Chinese economic miracle was not all 40 years miracle. For 3 years, after 1989, the economy went backward due to sanctions around the globe, but also the lack of cooperation with the system by Chinese people. So that pressure put Beijing into a position, and Deng Xiaoping came again and said, okay, we're going to yield one more step. And then we want Chinese people to give in your submission. The deal was carried out not because Chinese people were satisfied with that deal, but nevertheless, again, if tomorrow can be better than yesterday, and if we can enjoy a little bit of the freedom that we didn't have in the past, we didn't, okay, we will enjoy that freedom. Plus the fear of 1989 massacre, and then the very strong presence of the more precise policing by the Communist Party is very much presence. And so that deal, I call it as lousy deal, because both political freedom and economic freedom were belonging to Chinese people to begin with. They traded one of our freedom with another one. So it's a lousy deal. Nevertheless, that deal has been carried out until today. I would also point out the Western world have been playing a enabling role. They have introduced the engagement policy with China. We all know that policy actually started much earlier, in the Kissinger era, Nixon era, Carter era, and then carried out all the way. They're under two assumptions. One is that if China become economically powerful, it will nurture a strong middle classes that will naturally bring democracy into the society. Okay, if I may call this assumption as naive, the next assumption is not so naive. The next assumption is the world think, okay, even yes, we tolerate China Communist Party to be a dictator, to be a totalitarian regime, it's not going to impact the world much. It's probably will suppress some human rights in their own country, within their borders. But okay, too bad. The world will, in the meantime, enjoy the economic power the human rights abuses produces. So that assumption is not at all naive or innocent. But that has created what happened after 1989, a no longer lying Communist Party with accomplice by the world, an awakening Chinese people enjoying the little freedom they enjoy, while the moral standards completely collapse within China, and the world took 30 some years, and then maybe Hong Kong, and then this COVID, and then a former businessman president to come to its senses today. So that's my perspective of 1989. How did it happen, and then what its impact to later on today's world. And thank you very much, Wu Kaixi. Thank you.
Thank you, Wu Kaixi. Thank you for your viewpoints from domestic and also international perspective. And our next speaker is Professor Nathan. Andrew Nathan is a class of 1919 professor of political science at Columbia University. His teaching and research interests include Chinese politics and the foreign policy, the comparative study of political participation and the political culture and human rights. Professor Nathan has written numerous books and is a leading scholar on Chinese politics, human rights, and U.S.-China relations. He's another 中国人民的老朋友. So, by the way, Perry Link and Andy Nathan are among the earliest Western scholars who were banned from going to China. They have been not able to visit China since mid-1990s. So thank you so much for your support, Andy.
Thank you, Teng Biao. Well, Wu Kaixi and Perry were both there in 1989. I was not there, but later on, Perry came back to the United States quite soon after that. And he and I got involved in a project in the late 1990s, which came out as a book in 2001 called the Tiananmen Papers. This book is the English translation of selected, it is based upon a large body of documents from the regime, from inside of the regime. And then Perry and I supervised and edited the translation of this, of selected documents. It's quite a thick book, but it is not all of the documents. And that book came out in 2001. And so we agreed for this panel that I would discuss what that book tells us about the view from the regime side of the events. Wu Kaixi has described some of the elation and joyous feeling that happened during the demonstrations before the crackdown, what was going on inside the regime. Inside the regime, there was a sense of siege. This sense of siege had deep historical roots. Remember that the People's Republic of China was established in 1949 under the rule of Mao Zedong, and Mao Zedong continued to rule until his death in 1976. During those years of Mao's rule, China underwent a series of disastrous experiences, political struggles, economic experiments, a huge famine, a vast upheaval called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. As Perry mentioned, during that time, many Chinese wanted to be good people. They wanted to believe in Mao. But as that disaster continued on from 49 to 76, people's belief was really worn out. And when Mao died, the regime underwent a short political transition, a power struggle. And when Deng Xiaoping came to power in late 1978, so 2 years after the death of Mao, he faced a crisis, an economic crisis, a legitimacy crisis. The country was poverty-stricken. It hadn't really made economic progress in terms of the lives of the people, the living standards of the people. And he embarked on a policy called, as Wu Kaixi said, reform and opening, that was pragmatic. He threw away the Mao ideology in large part and said, we got to do what works, and tried to study from the West and open up to the West and so forth. The 1989 events happened at the end of the first 10 years of this reform and opening. They happened because the 10 years of reform and opening had been very difficult, tempestuous. There had been economic experiments, some of which quite successful, some of which failing. There had been openings of liberalization, the sort of thing where Kaixi described, where people thought they had the freedom to investigate, to have new ideas, and to say things. And then there were crackdowns. In 1987, the then party secretary, or was he the premier at that time, Zhao Ziyang, I think he was then the party secretary, he proposed a fairly profound political reform in which the ruling Chinese Communist Party would still be the ruling party, but it would play a less direct role in government. And that got defeated in the intra-party power struggle. People said that's going too far. And then Zhao Ziyang tried to push forward the economic reform with a reform of the price system that was part of state planning. And that also got into trouble. So as of the end of 1988, there was a sense in China that we don't know where we're going. We've had 10 years of experiment. The reform process is essential, but it lacks a direction. And there was the price reform had initiated a period of significant inflation, and a bad corruption had taken place, and people were completely unpersuaded of the official government ideology, which really was, they proclaimed a form of Marxism, but that was obviously fake at that point. And then the death of Hu Tao Bang, who was mentioned by Yu Kaishi, whom the students in particular and the intellectuals viewed as the person who stood for reform and stood for freedom of inquiry. People felt we're loyal, we're patriotic, we're not opposing the Chinese Communist government. Most people felt that. You heard Yu Kaishi say that he came to want to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party. But most people, I think, mentality in early 1989 was, we accept the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, but we need more freedom and we need a direction of reform. And Hu Tao Bang stands for that. The death of Hu Tao Bang triggered this what became a vast national movement. It started out as a relatively small student movement to say that the party should honor the memory of Hu Tao Bang. But as the party became paralyzed, and so this is the next thing that happened, is that the party leadership could not decide what to do. There was a severe split after the students began to demonstrate between people in the leadership, and in particular Zhao Ziyang, whose position was that the students are patriotic, they want the same reforms that we want to get rid of inflation, get rid of corruption, allow more creativity, more freedom among people who are loyal and who don't oppose the Chinese Communist Party. And Zhao Ziyang had supporters within the regime, quite a lot of supporters within the broad party membership, and even some supporters at the very top among the Politburo, the top organ of the Chinese Communist Party. So that was his view. But others in the top leadership, particularly represented by Li Peng, who at that point was the premier, took the view that if we, let me describe Zhao Ziyang's view. I didn't get to say enough about it. His view was, the students are patriotic and they want what we want, and we should hold dialogue with the students and explain that we share their views and persuade them that we've accepted their demands, basically, to move in the positive direction, and ask them therefore to vacate Tiananmen Square. But in the party meetings, the premier and many other top leaders, and especially the senior retired leaders, took the view that if we start to dialogue with the students, there's no end to it. China's a complicated country. There are students, there are intellectuals, there are workers, there are peasants, there are retired people, there are military people. If everybody's going to have the right to speak and make demands on us, we will completely lose control. That our regime is based upon highly centralized control by a small group of people who decide the correct direction. And this kind of regime can't survive if we start to have dialogue. One of the definitive events, I think, and Wu Kaishi can correct me if I'm wrong or talk about it some more if I'm right, is a dialogue that Li Peng did hold, in fact, with a group of students, one of whom was Wu Kaishi. It was televised. And Wu Kaishi, because the students by this time, the regime had not really decided what to do. They were having these internal debates. And the students said, you need to, dialogue with us or else we're going to have a hunger strike. And they started the hunger strike in Tiananmen Square. So Wu Kaishi, who was hunger striking, was dressed in pajamas, I would say, what looked like pajamas. I'm not sure he can tell us why he was wearing that particular outfit. And with other students held this televised dialogue. And Li Peng, who's the conservative guy in the leadership, took that dialogue to tell the students, you're breaking the law, you get out of Tiananmen Square. But Wu Kaishi behaved very, very, as he described that, he was a teenager, he behaved like a bad teenager might behave. He was very disrespectful and demanding and so forth. So I'm giving this example not to criticize Wu Kaishi, but to say that from the point of view of the regime, this was just another example. What's going to happen if we yield to these students? And things got worse. The demonstrations spread even farther. They spread to over 300 cities. And the regime's intelligence apparatus informed them that the foreign Western countries that have always hated, in their view, the Chinese Communist Party, especially the United States, are cheering for the students and are actually helping them. And right-wing, in the view of Beijing Communist Party, elements in Hong Kong are sending food and money. And this is an international effort to undermine our regime. And so they made the decision to crack down. To conclude, I want to say that the regime today that we see under Xi Jinping has the exact same mentality as those who made the decision to crack down in 1989. It believes that the system of rule that they have, and which in their view works pretty well, depends upon a tight monopoly of power with everybody else falling into line. That if there were any dialogue, even with lower level party members, any real dialogue, they have some fake dialogue, or with interest groups in society, the system would collapse, and that those who advocate that kind of democracy are doing so with the support and really as cat's paws of hostile foreign forces, such as Perry and me, the so-called friends of the Chinese people, and the US government and other governments who are in favor of democracy. So the current regime continues, or has really intensified, a crackdown on any sign, any initial sign of any kind of independent social activity, because they remember Tiananmen. They remember what can happen when the regime is disunited, when the regime is temporarily indecisive about what to do, when social movements from below are allowed to get out of control. They remember that, and they consider that to be a combined foreign and domestic threat. The fact that they feel that way suggests a certain fragility of the regime. We view on the outside the Chinese communist system as incredibly strong. And there are many ways in which that's true. It is very strong, but at the same time, the repressiveness of the regime signals a sense of vulnerability on their part, that the public support they have and the organizational efficiency that they have are both vulnerable in case there's any relaxation of control. So that's what we saw through the Tiananmen papers of the mentality of the regime, and my thoughts about the legacy of that mentality today. Thank you very much.
Professor Nathan, thank you so much. It's as a teacher, it's quite nice to hear some of the things that I feel like I always have to bring to the fore and remind my students, both in terms of the joy that was present in the 1980s that gets lost because of the success that the regime has had, as well as the widespread, the fact that it was a movement that spread over the whole country. Two small, seemingly small facts that actually are hugely important for how the regime has succeeded in creating a kind of amnesia even overseas about what actually happened in 1989, which is a nice way to bring us to our final panelist, Louisa Lim. Louisa is an award-winning journalist and the author of The People's Republic of Amnesia, Tiananmen Revisited. She is currently senior lecturer in audiovisual journalism at the University of Melbourne. Or senior lecturer of journalism at the University of Melbourne. She's was previously correspondent for NPR, reporting for China for over a decade. She opened NPR's Shanghai bureau in 2006, reporting indefatigably from Shanghai, Tibet, North Korea, the Shanxi coal mines. She covered illegal abortions in Guangxi in 2008, the Sichuan earthquake, and the Beijing Olympics. And as our students have read, her research uncovered the massacre, the extent of the massacre in Chengdu, and helped to expose the CCP's erasure of the memory of June 4th. Reflecting on the crackdown then and its implications today, Louisa Lim recently authored an essay on Hong Kong and the Tiananmen playbook, in which she thought about Beijing's current attitude through a historical perspective. So in many ways, she's a perfect person to hear from next, both on memory and projections for the future and the implications for events in Hong Kong as well. So Louisa.
Hi, thank you so much, Johanna. Thank you to Teng Biao as well for organizing this and giving me the opportunity to be part of this panel. So I wrote my book when I was based in China as a foreign correspondent, and it came out in 2014. And I just kind of remember at the time, it was very much this sense, why should you write about Tiananmen? It's no longer relevant. But in fact, what we've seen over the years is that it has become not less and less sensitive, but more and more sensitive as time has gone by. And also, if we kind of look back at what's happening in Hong Kong over the last 2 years, I think we also see the uses of Tiananmen in sort of providing almost like a playbook for the regime. So I'm going to talk about that a bit, and I'll talk about how the memory, what happened to the memory of Tiananmen, because that's really what my book was about. So I actually interviewed a number of people, including Laura Kaisi, so it's nice to see you today, on their role in what had happened. And you know, one of the things that I wrote about was this incredibly intense propaganda campaign after the crackdown, where there was sort of 24-hour-a-day films on television, you know, and they were really, so it wasn't a denial of what happened. It wasn't what we see today, where there's just no discussion. It was an attempt to take that narrative and to imprint a kind of state-run narrative that everybody understood that what happened was not peaceful protests. According to the state, it was counter-revolutionary riots. And so, for example, those pictures of Tank Man were shown again and again, the man standing in front of his tank, in front of a tank on Tiananmen, the Avenue of Everlasting Peace, Chang'an. And these were shown to sort of show the restraint of the state, that this tank did not, well, run down that man. And when I wrote my book, I interviewed a soldier who had been part of that suppression effort. And he talked about how part of his role was also a propaganda role after the crackdown. He spent 2 months in Beijing, where he just went kind of from work unit to work unit, talking about how, you know, the suppression effort and being sort of feted as a hero. In Chengdu, where there were also people killed, the state put out a propaganda booklet, a very thin book, but they put out 700,000 copies in a single month. So it was a real attempt to sort of dominate and exert narrative control. And then over time, the story changed. The state kind of, those picture books and propaganda booklets disappeared from shelves, and the state stopped talking about Tiananmen once it had set that narrative. And I argue in my book that it's actually been very successful in silencing the memory of what happened. You know, I did a very crude, not at all academic experiment where I went around university campuses to talk to young Chinese people to find out what they knew. And when I showed them that picture of Tank Man, only 15 out of 100 people could recognize it. And it's a very crude experiment, but it was really interesting to me that I could tell who knew that it was sensitive from their body language alone. You know, that picture is so taboo that if you know what it is, there was like literally a sort of physical sensation where people would move away from it as if it would sort of harm them. And I found, you know, as I went on book tour and I spoke to audiences, that people would admit themselves to the act of forgetting. And there was one particular incident where I showed pictures from Chengdu, and there was a member of the audience there who had been a university student in Chengdu at the time. And she stood up in question time and she said, I was there, I saw all those things, and I forgot about it myself until this moment. And I just found that so interesting, that not only was the impulse to forget sort of something that the state implanted, but it was also a personal thing that I think people almost feel like forgetting is an act of sort of survival and self-preservation. So I think the memory of Tiananmen has been really important and sort of controlling that. But what we're also seeing is the way in which Tiananmen is being rolled out, or has been rolled out by the state as a playbook for what happened or is happening in Hong Kong. I've got a couple of slides that I can share if I can, about that. And it really follows on from what Andy was just saying. So after 1989, after the crackdown, the very first appearance by Deng Xiaoping, when he congratulated the troops who had suppressed the protests, he made the statement, which I think has been really foundational, you know, saying, as soon as a trend emerges, we should not allow it to spread. During the last 10 years, our biggest mistake was in the field of education, primarily in ideological and political education, not just of students, but of people in general. So I think those two prongs have been really key in the state's attitude towards protest. You know, number one, the growth of this sort of security apparatus, that this protest should not be allowed to spread. And number two, a more intense ideological and political education effort. And we have seen that in all kinds of ways, but through the growth of the security apparatus, the intimidation of activists, censorship and control of information, all of these have been designed to stop protests from spreading. The picture is actually from Chengdu, from an example that I write about in my book, when in order to head off a protest in Chengdu in 2013, the state actually changed the days of the week. It suddenly made everybody go to work on the Saturday when the protest was supposed to be. And the entire city, all schools, all work units, everything was changed in order to stop one sort of not very large environmental protest. And then the state, at the same time, it had staged a big security campaign, putting out on the streets all these sort of police forces and security forces, and that's a picture from that. So it just shows the extent to which the state fears protest. The rhetoric of turmoil is something else that I really think stemmed from the Tiananmen playbook, but we saw such similar rhetoric in relation to Hong Kong, which is, you know, completely different context. But very soon after the protests in June 2019, it was, I think, after the second protest, there was this labeling of the protests as a riot. So that was really the act of making sure people understood the state's position that this was not peaceful. And the rhetoric that we saw used in Hong Kong really was very similar to that we saw in Beijing, and it absolutely amplifies what Andy was just saying about the idea of the Communist Party kind of being under permanent siege from its enemies. So the protests were blamed on black hands. That phrase was used in 1989 as well, who were seen as very small number of people driven by external hostile forces. And there was no engagement, there was no discussion with protesters in Hong Kong, and perhaps that is that decision was possibly driven by the memory of what happened when Wu Kai-shi sat down in his pajamas and everybody was watching it on television. It was a television event. And the language that is used in the state-run media is very much, you know, increasing the stakes. So it's a life and death struggle. The language of virology is used, that democracy is a virus, an infection. And it's the same language that we see used about Islamic radicalism in China as well. When force is used, according to the Tiananmen playbook, it must be overwhelming. I mean, it can happen in different ways. In Hong Kong, I guess one thing that was learned from Tiananmen, it was not the PLA, it was not the army that was sent in, but the police force was, and it happened over a much longer period of time. So in many ways, what happened in Hong Kong was more similar to what happened in Chengdu, where the protests were put down by People's Armed Police. And in most cases, they did, you know, they were not opening fire. Again, the use of propaganda is really key to frame dissenters as rioters and to set that frame for both an internal audience. And this time, in the case of Hong Kong, we've seen that message turn outwards as well to try and spread that for an external audience. And we saw a lot of Twitter accounts spreading propaganda about Hong Kong. The ideological education and control effort that we've seen that happened after Tiananmen in the form of patriotic education. So the patriotic education campaign really started after Tiananmen and continues to this day. In Hong Kong, we're seeing it national security education, and it's across the board in Hong Kong schools and universities. Newspapers are being brought under control. Political activists, political parties, non-governmental organizations, and even history. Once more, we're seeing how that is being rewritten in Hong Kong. Modern history, as well as, you know, even going back to the history of Hong Kong's session in 1840, textbooks are being written right now, rewritten right now. So all of that, I think, harkens back to the Tiananmen playbook. What has been so key in Hong Kong has been that Hong Kong has been the one space where people have been able to remember publicly what happened in 1989. And last year, that vigil was banned on COVID safety grounds. But still, people came out to remember. What's so important now is that memory, that space for remembering has now been closed down. So 26 pro-democracy leaders have been charged with participating or inciting others to take part in an unlawful assembly. A maximum sentence for that is 5 years. So, I mean, just think about that, 5 years for an act of memory. So on the right, the picture on the right-hand side is the young generation of Hong Kong political activists and figures. And of that group sitting down in that picture now, every member is either in prison or in exile. Picture on the left is some of the main leaders of the alliance in support of the patriotic democratic movement in China. So they're the ones who have organized this vigil every year. Albert Ho, on the very left-hand side of that picture, he was remanded in custody yesterday, along with another vice chairman, Li Chak-yen in the middle, is already in custody. So it's the first time that, the whole leadership of the alliance is in custody at the moment. So what will happen this year is not at all clear. But yesterday, Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, said she could not yet say whether it would be illegal to attend this this vigil this year. And finally, my last very quick point is that this is all changing the way that Tiananmen is remembered and marked overseas. And I went to the vigil in Melbourne last year, and what was so interesting was that it really yoked together what happened in China, in Beijing in '89, and what happened in Hong Kong. So you can see the pictures on the left-hand side, they're showing pictures from '89. On the right-hand side, they're showing pictures of, glory to Hong Kong. And a lot of the slogans that were shouted were not only slogans from '89, but slogans from Hong Kong. I think, the national security legislation that's been put in place in Hong Kong could be used to try to intimidate people from remembering June the 4th publicly anywhere in the world, because it is not limited. It has a global remit. So at this moment in time, even the act of sort of global remembrance is becoming more difficult. I think that's why it's really important that we still continue to have these kind of discussions. Li Chak-yen said we must remember mourning June the 4th is not a crime. I think it's also important that we continue to talk about it publicly. So thank you, I'll stop there.
Louisa, thank you so much. And I realized in your biography, I didn't mention that you grew up in Hong Kong, right?
Yeah.
So we have on our panel, someone who grew up in Hong Kong, and we have Wu Kai-shi, who's tied to the situation of the Uyghurs. So we actually have, and then with Perry and Professor Lincoln and Professor Nathan, we have people with such a longstanding investment in both remembering this, but also in the situation of democratization or rights for people in the PRC and the greater China sphere. We have a question from a student that I'd like to read. This is directed to Wu Kai-shi. So you can read along in our Q&A box as well. I have read that during the student thanks you for joining us and taking the time to speak with us, and then says, I've read that during the June '89 student protests, students engaged in dialogue with soldiers around the square, sharing pamphlets and cigarettes. They say this was so effective at wearing down the soldiers that Deng Xiaoping had to replace the battalion before the crackdown began. State censorship and suppression of online dialogue is increasingly sophisticated and successful. What role do you see for public demonstrations and public dialogue in today's China? Can employees of the state, not top levels, but the middle, be engaged with a thorough, persistent public attempts at dialogue? Or are the dynamics of 1989 student protests impossible to replicate in a China that's able to create a totalitarian police state like we see in Xinjiang?
A very good question. Thank you very much. The key word within this question is actually a dialogue. A dialogue was also a key word that throughout the 80s, the Chinese Communist Party have implanted in our mind. So that wasn't really a student's invention in 1989. We said we want dialogue because dialogue represents a open and vivid society that the Communist Party also lectured about. But then they just weren't sincere about it. But we wanted to capitalize their propaganda to say, you said dialogue, it's a good thing. So we actually wanted. And then we learned in a very harsh way, the answer the Communist Party can come up with to a real demand of dialogue is a bloodbath. And then we have been continuously learning that same lesson now, that when Tibetans ask for dialogue, they send in troops. When Hong Kongers want dialogues, they denied it, and then they sent in police. And then when Uyghur people, when Ilham Tohti wanted dialogue, rather he just started the dialogue one way, then they muted him and sentencing him to life. So what's the lesson here? The Communist Party, the only relation it understands that it can strike with other different political opinionated force, or it can have with any other party that doesn't share its own interests, its submission. That's the only thing Communist Party understand. 2 years ago, in the Tiananmen commemoration, 30 years commemoration, I spoke in the US Capitol, and then I told the US Congress and through them to America that basically you will be much better off to consult a criminologist when you try to strike your China policy instead of international relation experts. Because you need to understand the real nature of the Chinese Communist Party is just a group of bandits, and then they no longer afraid to admit that. So a dialogue, whatever middle level or higher level, if you know the Communist Party from in their mind is really, really afraid of this very key word. And come to think about it, on what front, on which policy that they can win any dialogue, any debate. They can lose. They will lose in every front. So that's why they probably decided just not to have any dialogue at all. So this is a time that we realize demanding dialogue with Chinese Communist Party has to be done in a very, very different fashion, namely very strong pressure. Strong enough, even a bandit have to crave. So that's why I urge United States to consult their criminologist. And then the United States have done quite some deals, when they, quite some, in the past, they have a lengthy history of dealing with criminal states, and then with some success. So maybe they should also consult with those in CIA in overthrowing the regime or such. I mean, half jokingly. Before I before I end this, I would like to protest against Nathan, Professor Nathan. I wasn't a bad boy talking to Li Peng. I wasn't. I was. I was 21 years old, no longer a teenage, and then even back in the Great Hall of People, when I sat down with confront Li Peng, I was firm, and then I was a representative of a rising force, and then has been continuous applying pressure to our opponent, which is the Chinese regime. I think my attitude was adequate. Actually, if you went through the scripts and the video and that night, I was quite polite too. I was firm, and then that being firm to the perspective of Li Peng is impolite, and then I hope that is not yours, Andy.
I support you.
I'm going to intervene too. That speaks to the outsized influence of a television documentary. I mean, of a documentary too. That we will always remember. Kai-Shi's pajamas has a lot to do with Karma Hinton.
Also, sorry. Yes, Andy mentioned that asked me to answer why was I wearing a pajama. And then I have been saying it for the last 32 years, and then I don't think answering you this time will make a difference. It wasn't a pajama, it was a hospital gown. Here I say it again, but I don't think it will satisfy all the demands of this question. Why am I wearing pajama? Maybe I
I
should
think if
just
you think
go.
about it as the way that imagery got preserved is a very
I know. Maybe I should
interesting
just
thing.
you and from now on admit it was a pajama. It was a political statement, but it
Was
really
The
was.
political
Was a
statement of the hospital garb is probably more powerful.
Was it a hospital pajama?
Yes, hospital.
But-
Yes, hospital gown, pajama, whatever. They put you in the hospital because I escaped from hospital back to Tiananmen when I heard there was an opportunity that finally the government, someone from the government will have a direct counter talk with, counter talk is the Chinese transliteration of 对话, right? So they finally, after many, many days of the student applying pressure to the regime, they will sit down with us. We were hoping it was a counter, it was a dialogue, it's a counter talk. It actually happens in May 18th, exactly 32 years ago. There is a clubhouse discussion room organized by Feng Congde, continued from the beginning of the Tiananmen the movement until June 4th, and it's going on. And last night, many of the participants in that meeting, counter talk, dialogue in May 18th were there last night. Wang Chaohua, Xiong Yan, Wang Dan, and then I think we have successfully established one argument, and at least I insisted on that I was not impolite. And then the decision to suppress the student movement was actually made May 17th, before that meeting take places in Deng Xiaoping's home. And then the meeting took place in the Great Hall of People, was supposed to be a showcase to convince Chinese people that the suppression is necessary because, look, the government, the great leaders of the country and party have already shown enough patience and tolerance to the students. They did not anticipate the students stood firm on our feet, and the CCTV people decide to air the recorded meeting anyway. And then that I don't think, and then I strongly want to argue strongly about this, that the decision of suppression was not a consequence of that meeting. And the matter of fact, it was decided before the meeting, and the meeting supposedly to be part of the decision. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Here's a question, maybe for Andy or Perry. It's a broad question. Like one result of the Tiananmen was the so-called China's economic development, like the China miracle. So actually, Chinese Communist Party argued that maybe the crackdown is bloody, but without Tiananmen, the crackdown, massacre, they won't use this word. There wouldn't be China economic miracle. So what do you comment about this?
Perry?
I would say, first of all, we need to recognize that the economic miracle was not the doing of the Communist Party of China. If you look at the neighboring countries to China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, you see booming economies that have done at least as well, if not better than China's. And when you look at China's boom, it rankles me to have it said that the leadership did this. The people who worked hard did this. If you see hundreds of millions of people flocking to the coastline, working in what we would call sweatshop conditions sometimes, 7 days a week, 30 days a month, no protection from a union, a real union, no protection from a free press or an independent court. Do they generate a lot of wealth? Yes, of course they generate a lot of wealth. This accelerated after Tiananmen because of, I think, Zhu Rongji's move mostly to let the top leaders compartmentalize the economy, as I was saying before, and go make a lot of money. for their own families. And did this generate a lot of wealth? Yes, it did, but that's not because of the wisdom of the massacre by any chance. It's terribly distorted to say that a massacre caused that boom.
Yeah, Andy, do you want to answer
The,
this?
the direct result of Tiananmen was that the conservatives came to power and they did not pursue any further economic reform, and the economy stagnated for a couple of years. And after that, Deng Xiaoping made his famous trip to the South and said, you guys have to get off your butts and do economic reform. So I really don't think that Deng Xiaoping's trip to the South was caused by the Tiananmen crackdown. It was, if anything, it was delayed by the Tiananmen crackdown.
We have another question for Perry in the queue. This is, can you please explain a little bit more about the effects of the 1989 event that induces the world that you mentioned in the end of your talk? He's curious, this is an anonymous attendee who's curious about your perspective on that.
Perspective on the way the massacre affected the sort of fake social relations that we now see? Is that it?
I think that's the gist of it. You know, how do we get from the massacre event to the cynical world and the broken social covenant that you described?
I argue that it's deep in Chinese culture, and I would argue that you can find this in ordinary daily life Chinese language, that to behave properly, to be a good person, is very deep in the culture. If you're going to be a good person, you have to know what the word good means. And for centuries, to generalize too broadly perhaps, but I'll do it anyway, that was these Confucian values about personal relations, how one should treat family members and therefore the larger society outside of it. And then you get to the 20th century and the May 4th movement says, 打倒孔家店, knock down Confucianism and sons, and there's confusion for a while, great confusion, one would have to say. The socialist system comes along in the 50s, and although there was terrible violence in the early 50s in the land reform, we know all of that, there was an engagement of the socialist values in this Chinese cultural habit of being a good person and knowing what that meant. Then you get the Great Famine and you get the Cultural Revolution that really undermines those values. And people by the late 70s are starting, before Mao died even, what are we going to believe in? And the reform comes along and, okay, maybe there's a breath of life in this socialist language. Let's try again. And as Hu Tao Bang has described, there was hope in the 80s that we can do something. And dialogue was possible. I mean, even Wei Jingsheng, who's your prime dissident, right? He talked about the fifth modernization, which is an echo of the four that Deng Xiaoping had pointed out. So even he is trying to interact with the top. Then you get the massacre. It's dead. It's gone. There's no way to attach values that we can rely upon in our public covenant with each other and that we can hook up with the top on. So it just becomes money making in this narrow nationalism. And for an individual person, that means watch out for yourself, go out in society and put on whatever mask you need in whatever context in order to be smart and get ahead materially. The whole rise of religion, it seems to me, is a reaction to that problem. Because human beings, Chinese included, want to have consciences. They want to have values to believe in. But we're left with this interlocking fakery. I have to use that word again now. And the question was, how does this June 4th have to do with it? June 4th, as I tried to say before, I see as a turning point. It really was the end of any hope of investment in the socialist values. And therefore, completely being adrift at what to do next and having nothing to turn to except materialism and narrow nationalism, and then here and there trying to revive religions. But I don't think it was just June 4th. I tried to say before, that whole paradigm that brings the society into that problem was created by the Mao Zedong years.
Yeah, maybe next question is to Louisa. What are the similarities and differences between CCP playbook and Putin's playbook? Are there methods of corruption, disinformation, kleptocracy that can be exported to liberal democracies, turning elections into shams?
Oh, thank you for that question. I'm not really able to talk about Russia in great detail, but I could maybe approach that question from looking at the point of view of the use of propaganda, and I think maybe taking in the other question also about discursive hegemony and how China has tried to build up its discourse power globally. I think there's a really interesting comparison with Russia. I actually just did a report with Julia Bergen for the International Federation of Journalists, and it's looking at the ways in which China is almost trying to export its propaganda through the use of global journalism unions, but also in the last kind of couple of years through disinformation and misinformation on social media platforms that are banned still in China. And in the course of researching this report, we interviewed a lot of experts and also a lot of journalists. It's actually quite interesting. The approach to propaganda is really quite different. Russia's approach is, you've got RT, you've got this very clear sort of dis and misinformation. But from the Chinese perspective, what they've done much more is to build whole information networks overseas. So for example, in Africa, the switch from analog to digital television is something that Chinese companies have really moved in on. And so they provide satellites, they provide programming, they give under various aid schemes, free televisions, free satellite TVs to various villages. And so they're really very, so they're moving into sort of telecommunications networks, as well as working with journalists and with journalism unions in order to try and shift that message. And it's all, controlling the narrative is so important for the Communist Party, but doing that overseas is increasingly important as well. And from our research, we found that even COVID, China has been able to leverage that and has been able to gain positive coverage overseas. Its image post-COVID is actually more positive than its image pre-COVID overseas. And a lot of that is through the very skillful use of propaganda, of building these networks, and also using medical aid, and then refracting that and using the dispatch of medical aid as propaganda as well. So when we speak to experts about the differences between Chinese and Russian propaganda, they often say, particularly sort of information warfare experts, that what China's doing is actually more sophisticated than the Russian attempt. And to the questioner who asked about the success of Chinese propaganda at home, I mean, one of the ways in which it has been successful has been the sort of total choking off of every other viewpoint. And I think WeChat has also been really successful at that as well, because if you're on WeChat, you're not going to read about other points of view. And then when you get these large student populations who are going overseas, who are primarily getting all their information and all their news from WeChat, those kind of closed discursive spaces are exported. So I think yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question or not, but from a propaganda perspective, that's what we were looking at. And it is a very interesting comparison.
If I may, I also saw the questions there about this discursive hegemony, and then I also the question was also kind of directed to me and in repeating what I was talking about, the dialogue. Well, yes, the Chinese Communist Party have been successfully gaining its discursive hegemony because, first of all, they denounce anybody who have a true ability to have a dialogue with the regime. We, the students, lawyers like Peng Biao and rights defenders, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, whoever wants to have a genuine dialogue, they suppress. And those who actually have an access to have a dialogue with the Chinese regime, given up for many decades. I'm talking about the Western world. The Hu Xijin or the Zhanlang, the spokesperson of the Chinese foreign Minister of Foreign Affairs, been able to having their one-way monologue for all these years because the Western world decided that there is a certain legitimacy of the Chinese regime, and then the world order demands we respect that voices. So in the internet, we were called fanzai, and it's a recent term. I really like it, fanzai, rebellious. Okay. And then also, of course, there are terms on the internet. We talk about 50 cents parties or little pinkies. Little pinks. Recently, there was a post says, 50 cents parties and little pinks. You will never win an argument against those fanzai, those rebellious, because their desire for freedom is genuine. That's a strong statement. If you really conduct into a dialogue with a dialogue, a debate, a challenge with a genuine desire of universal values, how could you lose any debate against Communist Party? First of all, that kind of dialogue is not happening in China, and it's not happening against China. And then I think after, it took a businessman, president of the United States, to realize that the following the world order is benefiting China, not the world, for many, many years. And then I also took 2 years of resilience, fighting of Hong Kong people for the world to realize that this regime that they are dealing with is not one of the responsible players in this international arena. And of course, millions of Uyghurs thrown into internment camp have made the world to realize this regime is actually a direct threat to the civilization we finally accomplished in the not just last decades, but last centuries. And then when come to this senses, the world, I hope one day become, adopt the mentality of the fanzai, of the rebellious, and then just to talk about the genuine desire of freedom and peace and democracy. Only when you adopt this kind of mentality, when you talk to Chinese government, especially those who have access to discuss this with Chinese regime, then a dialogue, and then the discursive hegemony that we're seeing today will then shift course. And then thugs like Hu Xijin, also mentioned by this attendee. Why do I call Hu Xijin a thug? Simple. I mean, he's a chief editor of a so-called media platform that doesn't allow any rebuilding of his opinion. So what do you call what else do you call that other than thugs? But the reason those thugs' voices is still on the top is because who can really have their voices got across? I'm talking again, the Western world, Western governments is not doing its job. Thank you.
So we're coming to we're past our time. We're coming to the time when we ought to be wrapping up. I'm going to try to package a small question to give back to you to each talk for about a minute or so. And then we can let the people who are, for whom it's evening, go to sleep. The rest of us will have the joy of having started our day with this stimulating conversation. We have a number of questions in the discussion board for this, the questions that have been rolling in, and then also on the discussion board that we had for the class that ask about any potential for hope in the current situation in China, and often counter that against the extremely perilous situation for people in Hong Kong, and whether or not there's any space for protest in Hong Kong. What is the space available for Uyghurs? So what does Tiananmen, one thing that I'm thinking about, and that clearly lots of our attendees are thinking about, is what the future looks like. So that might be one way to think about your final comment. What does the space look like? And there is a kind of transition between controlling the memory of the massacre through opportunity and propaganda and the kind of economic exchange that where Kai-Shi talked about, that trade-off. You get economic freedoms, but no political freedoms, and the more stringent model that seems to be in place in Xinjiang, and that is powered by surveillance. And so I find myself torn between the kind of optimism that where Kai-Shi expresses when he says, well, the people who want freedom should win in any debate because they are motivated by true good universal values, and then the overwhelming power that we see on the side of the state. So I don't know if that would be something that you'd like to reflect on in your final minute, or anything else that you'd like to close our evening with. And I don't know if you want to go, what order, if anyone wants to speak first.
I'm happy to go first. And I would just like to answer Vicky's question, who asks for Hong Kong specifically, but I think it's a wider question, not just for Hong Kong. She asked, what can Hong Kong do to preserve memories of June the 4th in the future under the national security law, when not only the vigil, but public discussions may unfortunately be suppressed? And I mean, to answer that question, I think it's, a wider question. Students overseas, Chinese students overseas, what can be done? And I think the answer is education, to think about it, to talk about it, to do what you can do whilst remaining safe. So in Hong Kong this year, the Alliance has suggested other ways of remembering. You don't necessarily have to lay yourself open to arrest by gathering, just light a candle wherever you are at 8 o'clock to remember in your own way. And I think, the act of talking about it, of reading about it, of educating yourself and educating other people is another important way of remembering. And, I think we see more than ever that the act of remembering June the 4th is relevant today. It's important, and it is still necessary.
So I'll go. So I think the events of 1989 that we've been talking about, and the recent developments in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and so forth, show the tremendous force on both sides. The regime is very, very determined. It has enormous assets. It has money. It has a huge security apparatus. It's not about to give up. It's not tottering. It's not Gorbachev having lost faith in itself. In fact, it's rising. China's rising. The regime is not about to voluntarily cash in. And actually, the survey research in China, both by the Asian Barometer survey, which I participate in, but lots of other surveys that I think are accurate, show that most of the public in China supports the regime. And why not? The economy has been growing, and the government is standing up to the United States and making Chinese people proud. But at the same time, China's developing a huge middle class. that wants the things that Kaishi talked about. They want freedom and they want to be able to think. So I feel that the Chinese situation is not yet stabilized. It is still in tremendous tension between different forces, but I'm not optimistic, A, that change will come very soon, and B, that change will necessarily be very pretty to look at when it does happen.
I'll go next so that Kaishi can wrap up. On the matter of hope, I think my biggest hope is in recognizing that the human brain has levels. I'll tell a very quick anecdote about this. When Andy and I edited the Tiananmen papers, a couple of years later, there were two high officials from Tsinghua University who came to Princeton to talk about scholarly exchange. And we had a very elegant lunch at the faculty club. And then they asked if they could come to my office to keep talking. And I said, sure. And we went and we kept talking. One of them asked me where the men's room was. He had to go to the men's room. So I told him out the door, down the hall on the right. As soon as he left, the other one said, do you have the Tiananmen papers? And I did, right on my shelf. So I took down a copy and I signed my name and I handed it to him. He said, do you have an envelope? Yes, I have an envelope. And I put it in a manila envelope for him. And he did all of that and concealed it before his friend came back. No sign of that through the whole formal luncheon, but it was there in his mind. And indeed, it was urgent in his mind. Now link that with the experience I had just 2 days ago. I was on another panel with Cai Xia, whom you probably know, was a professor of the history of Communist Party ideology at the Central Party School until she had enough last summer and came to the US, and her bank accounts have been frozen and she's been harassed, her family and family. So she really cut her ties. But somebody asked her on this panel I was on 2 days ago, how many people at the top, near the top, are like you, who really had this other layer underneath and then it burst out? And she said, probably 60 to 80%. I believe that. And there are other anecdotes that make me believe that. I don't think that if, how should I put this? If Xi Jinping came out tomorrow morning and said, we're going to change everything, we're going to be democratic now, we're going to have elections and a free press, I don't think that the society would come running at him saying, no, 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 you've done so well as an authoritarian government, we want you. So in that sense, I think, Andy, the surveys that you just mentioned, what gets surveyed is what is sayable at the top, and what is underneath might be something else. And of course, there's no way to measure that. I can't, except by anecdote, measure it. But I do think, and here I'll echo work I see, human beings are human beings. And if you are really a fanzi attached to universal values, that's going to have staying power. And I think it's inside of Chinese people. I'll stop there.
Thank you for echoing that. In the past 30-some years being a democracy activist in exile, one of my narrative has been like, okay, the West, when we talk to the West, it's like the West, the world, United States government, European, Japanese. We know pushing China toward democracy is not your responsibility, it's ours. But we urge you to stand on the right side and avoiding standing on the wrong one. That has been my narrative for until about 5-6 years ago, and then I changed it and I said, well, you know what? You enabled this monster. It is your responsibility too to bring it back before it's too late. And then I hear some arguments to say, no, China is so big and it's very determined. Professor Nathan just said that, yes, because we allowed it and we made it, we nurtured this monster to become what it is today. Is it late? Well, yes, it is. It is quite late. The best timing for the world to push China to the right course and becoming a responsible member of the world community would have been 1989, right after the massacre. But then at that time, United States-led Western democracy decided to cut a slack. And then I described earlier, based on two assumptions, one naive, the other not so naive. And then it turned out to be both assumptions are wrong. It didn't come through, these assumptions. So China did not become a democracy automatically. Chinese insertion today is in a global level to the very civilization we're living in. So not only because the world shared the piece of blame that making China what it is today, but it is also in the world's interest to defend ourselves from this monster we accidentally, well, not so accidentally, but stupidly created. So, so it is. I hope also Western, scholars, especially sinologists like you, can play an important role. And by echoing, I hope you can join my pointing this out. That the Chinese communists understand only one kind of relation anybody, including the world, to have with itself. That is total submission. And when you should stop saying things like, the Communist Party, they cannot afford losing face, so they're face loving. No, they're shameless. They're total shameless people. So for giving the world a right advice, I hope, is the sinologist and scholars, international relations, and a criminologist can give to the decision makers in the world, that to deal with this beast is to admit we have made a stupid mistake in the past many years. And then now, it was already quite late, but of course, it will be too late if we do not correct it, the wrong today. And thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists. We've kept everyone, the panelists and audience, a little bit later, but I hope has been worth it for everyone. I want to remind our audience, and also, of course, invite our panelists if they're interested in joining, that next week at 4 p.m. Chicago time on Wednesday, May 26th, we have a session on the Olympic Games and human rights in China, which is an interesting way to build on Wu Kaixi's final closing thoughts for us about the role of the world and what our responsibilities are with the world. So again, thank you. Have a wonderful evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are, and let's keep the conversation going so that this can be remembered. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.